Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Bishop, and welcome to GigaBIX 101. Today we are going to be punching down a hydra cable onto a GigaBIX can. Behind me here you will see some already installed GigaBIX lines, partially done, and an open rack where we can put brand new switches. But we'll be focusing today on how do you punch down onto GigaBIX cans, and we'll be rejoining you in just a moment with a close-up of just exactly that. Before we can move on to punching down the hydra cables into the GigaBIX can, we need to discuss how to properly lay in the hydra cable so that you have the exact length needed for the punch downs. This is the next bundle, 50-foot Cat 5e hydra cable, 12 legs, terminated RJ45. For cable identification and cable marking, I've acquired some colored zip ties and some colored tape. This is the starting of a hydra cable lacing through the rack assembly. And notice how I've got it color coded as orange, a single stripe of orange, and also written on the clear bundling switch 1, cables 1 through 12, and I've split out the odd cables, which will come down from the top, and the even cables up from the bottom. So you have to know where your switches are going to be in the rack. The spot above that is going to be for a fiber optic core switch, and the spot above that for a router, and the spot above that for a fiber optic patch bay. So being aware of where you are in a rack is important. Keeping your cables identified, separated, and dressed as you go is also very important. Okay, now that we've got our cables started up through the rack assembly, let's look at how it's dressed up the vertical, and as it transitions to the top, notice how I've left room for additional cables to be added onto this assembly, keeping everything dressed to the right so that we can add other cables as we proceed with more switches. And please ignore the background boxes and mess. This room is under construction. We're just looking at the cables and how they're laid along the ladder, secured in place as it transitions down the wall through some D-rings. I've used 5-inch D-rings along the wall to keep my cables dressed. It'll allow me to add another 12 hydra cables, and it's going to transition down the wall. Alright, so here we have two GigaBIX cans, one on the left without the GigaBIX connectors and designator strips, and the one on the right with the designator strips and connectors already installed. We'll be placing only a few big GigaBIX connectors and designator strips in the left block as we install the hydra cables. Let's talk about cable marking a little bit. I've gone with a permanent marker and I've written OLVA SO1 cables 1 through 12 onto the clear bundle wrapping, as well as a single stripe of orange. And I've continued that process as the cables enter the can, as well as designating which set of 12 they're on by placing a marker into the clear plastic where the cross connects will go. In these next two slides, we've prepared our next 6 lines, and we will be marking them on the outer sheath to where we will trim it back for the exact length where we'll place the termination bar. Okay, here you can see I've got cables 1 and 2 already punched down and terminated onto the GigaBIX connector using the GigaBIX termination bar. And each of the cables runs up through a Velcro strap to keep it secure. And notice how This is going to be connector 1 through 6, but we've actually placed it in the bottom slot. That's to give ourselves slack in the cabling. It will get turned and moved into the upper slot. So now we want to work on stripping back the next cable. As we punch down these cables, we're going to be using a GigaBIX termination bar that comes with the GigaBIX kit. So there are instructions inside that comes with the bag, and there are 75 termination bars for these 72, so you can only drop 3. They're very small. They have 2 tines, and they've got slots for each of the wires. So as soon as we strip back cable number 3, it's prepared here. I've got it marked and ready. It's going to go into this slot. You want to cut back a little bit of sheath, enough to grab the nylon string that's inside. So get rid of the outer sheath, pull it up to the previous marked line, cut that nylon string off, and then we're going to trim back this outer sheath. Make sure not to nick any wires, and then trim back the little pointed dog ears so that you have a very even and straight sheath. Should be squared up. And then we want to separate off the blue and the brown off to the sides, keeping orange and green down the center. And that's because we're going to add on this GigaBIX termination bar. We're going to orientate it so that the tines will go into the center of the cable. Therefore, we slip the orange into that slot, and then the green alongside of it. Slide it all the way up the wires until the termination bar approaches the sheath, and then slip the 2 tines into the center of the cable and push it all the way up square so that the cable is dressed or sitting very flush up against it. And once it's there, you hold it in place and snap the blue and the brown in from the sides, and then hold that termination bar tight up against the connector. There's a shelf that it rides up against. It'll sit right there, and now this termination bar will prevent an untwist. So we want to keep the white on the left. It can't untwist past that point. And we want to get the 2 center wires put in place, holds the connector squared up, and then do the outer ones. We use the point of the connector itself to separate the wires, and once it's laid in there, you have to lift up a little bit on the back of the connector to let it slide backwards and allow the wires to sit flush in the slot. Now that we've got all 4 pair placed inside, get your tool, make sure the cutter is down, and punch in, saying to yourself the color code so you make sure white blue, white orange, white green, white brown. And what that BIX termination bar has done is prevented any untwist and kept the wires all exactly separated at the same length. Okay, let's do this one more time for repetitive instruction here. And note how all the wires are being kept in parallel, and that we are terminating on the 2nd slot. This is going to be the top connector. It'll rotate over, and we'll see that a bit later, but this connector will eventually be in place on the top slot. So let's go for number 4 here. We've got 3 of them in place. Here's cable 4, and it's been marked previously. We're going to remove a little bit of sheath on the end, enough to grab the nylon string that's on the inside. You want to have a nice sharp pair of cutters. These are not. So we're going to give us a little cheater spot here to pull the string up through. And we're going to pull that right up to that previously marked line. and then get rid of the nylon. Pull back the outer sheath and trim it without nicking any wires. Get rid of the dog ears and square up the end of the sheath so that we have a nice flush surface to put the termination bar against. I'm just peeling back the wires and getting access to that line that I made previously. Alright, so we've got a nice squared up sheath. When you get to this point, you don't want to untwist the wires as they leave the sheath. You want to just pull the brown and the blue off to the side and then bring the green and orange down the center. And again, we're going to get one of our little termination bars out of the bag. Drop one, I'm going to find out in a second. And orientate it so that those tines will go right into the center of the cable. We're going to keep our colors in order. Now, as the cables or the wires exited the sheath, they came out in the reverse order of what they're supposed to be. But that's okay. You just want to keep blue, orange, green, and brown in that order. So I'm going to slide this termination bar up until the tines go right into the center of the cable, and then push it up until the flush end of the sheath rides in that slot. Hold it in place, and then snap the blue and the brown in from the sides. Now that we're ready, we just rotate this 180 degrees and lay that connector, keeping the wires in parallel, lay that connector or that termination bar up on the BIX connector. There's a shelf that connector rides up against, and you want to hold it there in place nice and tight. And then make sure white's on the left. Press the wires down into the slot, holding that cable or that connector nice and tight. The BIX termination bar prevents untwist past this point. So you just use the point on the connection to get all your wires separated. Now you lift up a little bit on the back of the connector and let it slide so all the connectors lay in flush into their slots. We get our tool, make sure it's orientated, the cutter down, and say to ourselves the color code, white, blue, white, orange, watching the wires, making sure you've got the right one in the right slot because polarity does matter. So now we've got equal separation and zero untwist at the termination point. Okay, now that we have all 6 of our cables properly terminated, we're going to add a retention bar to prevent the wires from being accidentally pulled out. So we're going to push this up from the bottom and snap it into place. And you do that just prior to rotating the connector. So now we want to take this connector out of that second slot, rotate it 180 degrees, and then put it into the upper slot where it was originally designed to go. Make sure we keep all of our cables nice and parallel. And we'll be preparing now for the next 6 cables that'll be going into the bottom. Note that when we did this top cable, they were all coming down. Top connectors, cables dressed down. Bottom connector that's going to go in here, all the cables will dress up so that when we rotate the connector, all of the terminations will be behind the designator strip. So I've got 2 of the cables installed now for the second row, cables 7 and 8. We have 9, 10, 11, and 12 ready to go, and I just wanted to show that as they dress up, you have to give yourself about 1 connector's length of room in excess to give room for when we rotate the connector. So draw a line across all of the cables after you've measured the length, and that way you'll be prepared to cut the sheath back at that exact spot. Okay, I wanted to show one more time how to strip this wire back as we dress it up from the bottom. We've made our mark here on the cable. I'm going to cut just a little bit of sheath off at the very end to give me access to the nylon string. And if it's a real short piece like this, you may have to cut a little cheater notch up into the sheath. And that allows the string to easily slip up in there and make the cut. And we pull the string all the way up until it gets to that mark that we made on the cable earlier. It doesn't have to be exact, but that's about where the mark is. So now we're going to trim off the nylon string and then trim back the sheath evenly at that point without nicking any wires, and then square up the end of the sheath by cutting those little dog ears off, and the back side make it nice and square. We have to have a square end on our sheath there so that the BIX terminator bar will push up nice and even. And again, want to pull the blue and brown out to the sides without untwisting as they exit the sheath, and leave the orange and green coming straight out. And that will allow our termination bar, if you orientate it correctly, for those two tines to slip up into the center of the sheath. So you want to keep your colors in order and place the two wires into the center holes. Slide the termination bar up those two wires, and then as the tines approach, center them into the sheath and then gently push it in. You might have to use a little bit of force to get it up in there, but you want to be gentle with it and keep your wires on this side of that butterfly. So I'm trying to push that sheath all the way deep inside, and once it's there, I hold it in place and then snap in the blue and the brown wires from the sides. There's a shelf right here on these two legs that fits, so you're going to have to push your excess back up inside, and then from the bottom hold that BIX termination bar tight up against the connector and let it rest on that edge, and then make sure you place the white onto the left side. We'll do the white orange first, and that helps center the connector in its place. I'm going to hold it up nice and tight and then push the wires in. Do the same thing with the white green. I can use my thumb to stop it from untwisting, help it to slide into its slot. And finally the white brown. And you want to lift up a little bit on the back side of this and let those wires fully seat into each slot. If you don't, the BIX tool will shine the top of the wire, removing some insulation. So now we're going to get our tool and orientate it so that the cutter is up. Always double check which side the cutter's on. Alright, so white, blue, white, orange, and also note that as you're cutting, if this wire is pushed back in like this, laying down flat, the cutter will not cut correctly. So they have to be lifted up straight. Alright, that was cable number 10, and we have left off to the side here 11 and 12 to go. Okay, we have all 12 cables terminated and the plastic retention bar in place. So now we'll rotate this bottom row 180 degrees. So notice as I do that how those termination bars lift up away from the connector. So their entire purpose is just to hold the separation of the pairs exactly the same and prevent an untwist at the termination point. All of the connections are now behind where a BIX designator strip will go. And we will be placing a label to show each of the pairs. This is done with Label Flex software, and we have the switch name and each of the connector ports. So this is actually from a different switch, we'll be creating a new label for this one. So we'll just leave it with a blank connector for now. This is just a side note about floating old cables away. So I've got some very old Cat 5 lines and cross connects installed in that one can. They used to be over here in this empty can, and I had to move them and float them out and get them out of the way so we could install new hydra cables. Note the other 4 hydra cables to the left, red, double red, yellow, double yellow, have already been installed. And that's for the one set of switches, and now we're going to move on to orange, double orange, and then green. So we're keeping everything dressed, identified, and marked. And after we've completed all this, we have the new switches in the rack. We'll start one at a time moving that mess, clearing that mess out of there, and then dressing things in with a 4-pair cross connect. And you can see some of that already completed. We've got some 4-pair cross connects going on right now. Alright, we've now laced in the second hydra cable for switch 1, numbers 13 through 24. You can see we've got it written on the clear marker here, plus identified as a double stripe of orange with both tape and zip ties, as well as where we're going to punch it down. I've separated the first 6 from the second 6, and we're going to work on these first 6. Now, since this first 6 is going to go in the upper connector, we're spacing it down 1 connector for slack, and we're going to dress them down. Alright, we're about halfway through the second hydra cable. I just wanted to show how many wires were coming up from the bottom. So we're going to end up having 6 hydra cables. 1 set here, 1 set here, 3, 4, 5, 6 sets of hydra cables. Imagine if you had all 6 sets, 72 wires running up there at the same time and trying to figure out which one was for the second, third, fourth switch, which one was. You got 3 sets of number 1s, 3 sets of number 12. So you need to do this 1 hydra cable at a time so that you make sure you keep everything straight. We're going to place the retainer bar, snap it in place, and then rotate the connector 180 degrees and slip it into the first slot. Or actually the third slot. The first slot in our double orange. So there we go. We've been trying to keep all the cables in parallel and not cross over one another. But as you install them and get them in place, they get quite jumbled, and it becomes part near impossible to keep them all in parallel. But we're trying as best we can. We'll be back in just a second. All right, now that we have 2 hydra cables installed, I suddenly remembered something I wanted to discuss almost right at the very beginning. We pull out one of these connectors and give an up-close look at the front. Notice that there are 2 bevels on this left-hand side, and that each of the front tips of the connector are color-coded: blue, orange, green, and brown, with a black separator for all 6. And at the very right is an unused blank pair. So as you put this connector in, you must keep this beveled edge and the blue to the left. So you slide it into the right and then put it into the left, keeping your color code blue, orange, green, brown, left to right, leaving the open pair, the 25th pair, unused pair, on the far right. This is Captain Bishop from the Starship Enterprise, and we will be engaging warp speed in just moments, so buckle up and prepare for your next adventure.